Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this lovely Monday afternoon before Thanksgiving. My name is Claudine Fox, and I am the Public Policy and Advocacy Director at the American Civil Liberties Union of Connecticut, otherwise known as ACLU. I am so excited to be able to be here with y'all to help facilitate this dialogue. Today's panel, Communities and Policing, Traffic Enforcement for Safer Streets, ? We'll dive into the impacts of policing, pedestrian safety, and explore maybe some alternative solutions that can keep everyone that's out on our roads safe. Before we launch into this juicy topic, I would like to take a minute to welcome our two panelists that are joining me for this discussion, Ken Barone and Mike Oretade. Ken and Mike, can you take a minute to introduce yourselves by answering the following questions? What's your name? What are your pronouns? And what brings you to this table?
I guess I can start. My name is Michael Oretade, and I'm the president of Black Lives Matter 860 of Hartford. He, him are my pronouns. I'm here today to just discuss the issues that I personally, that my organization, my people, my community have with the way that policing is done in our communities. It's something that means a lot to me to have these open discussions and conversations about all of the issues that intersect. So that's why I'm here. It's nice to meet you guys.
Thanks so much.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Barone. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy. I know that's a mouthful, at the University of Connecticut within the Department of Public Policy. And for the last almost decade, I have managed the state of Connecticut's racial profiling prohibition project. My pronouns are he, him, and what brings me to this conversation is largely the work that we've done over the last decade to try to study and address racial profiling here in the state of Connecticut. And I think we'll get into it a little bit later, but the program that we've implemented here in Connecticut has now been replicated in 4 other states. So Connecticut has become a leader in trying to address racial profiling. We've made progress. We have a long way to go. We can talk about that too. Because I know a good part of this conversation is also focused on traffic safety and the role that law enforcement play in traffic safety. We've also done a significant amount of research as a part of our work to try and understand the role that police play in traffic safety, and to try and understand the factors that do and don't drive racial disparities, both in stopping motorists and in searching motorists. And just to sort of ground our conversation, I think it's important to know that traffic stops are the most common encounter between law enforcement and the public. And so the reason why we spend so much time researching and understanding traffic stops is because of the routine interaction that it plays in our everyday lives. And so it's an important topic, and I'm looking forward to delving into this conversation.
Thanks so much, Ken. So just a quick housekeeping before we launch into the discussion. As you can see, this isn't in a webinar format. We are in a meeting format on Zoom. So I ask that y'all keep yourselves on mute. Keep your cameras off unless you're asking a question. And as Tony, our chat moderator, shout out to you, Tony, dropped in the chat just a little while ago, we're asking that you please hold on to your questions until the end of this conversation. While it feels like an hour and a half feels like a long time, it can go very, very quickly because we have so much information that we want to get through. So as I said, please drop your questions in the chat, and Tony will help me out in trying to sift through what we can get through in the time that we have. All right, let's get started, y'all. First question, what role do police play in roadway safety? And whoever wants to take it, y'all can take it.
I'll start if that's okay with you, Michael. So, police have historically played an important role in roadway safety, right? Traffic enforcement is a big component of policing here in America, and for better or for worse, right? And what we know is that there's on average just over 500,000 traffic stops typically conducted each year. It varies depending on the department and the community. And what our research has told us pretty consistently over the last decade is that when police use the motor vehicle laws to primarily focus on roadway safety, meaning they stop cars for things that cause accidents like speeding, following too closely, running a red light, running a stop sign, talking on your cell phone, we actually see little to no racial disparities in the data. But as police start to use the motor vehicle code, often to try and solve some other issue, maybe as a crime reduction strategy, as an example, we tend to see the law being applied differently across different communities and impacting people of different racial groups differently. And we tend to see little to no return on investment in terms of roadway safety. I hope we'll get into it a little bit, but where some of that policing comes from, right, which is really in my mind, an old vestige of the war on drugs, which is law enforcement being taught how to use the motor vehicle code to try and fight the war on drugs. So it was an idea that really came to fruition in the 80s and 90s. There was actual federal programs, one in particular called Operation Pipeline, which was a DEA training program teaching police how to take their motor vehicle code and use it to stop any car that they suspected of being suspicious and to get into that vehicle and search that vehicle. So that sort of changed the nature of traffic enforcement across the country. Which is why, what we have consistently tried to say is when the primary focus of traffic laws is to impact the safety of the roadways, that's a good thing, right? When we start to use the traffic code to try and solve some other problem, we get into a bit of a gray area, and we don't necessarily have a good return on investment in that case. So I'm sure we can get into it more. I'll let you probe that a bit, Claudine, but I do want to give Michael an opportunity to talk about this as well.
Just to piggyback off of what Ken is saying here, from what I know about traffic policing, the origins have always been in getting more money, right, for the municipalities, the local governments, right? So the reason why things are the way that they started were to make money to fund the department. And this is like, we're talking about the origins, right, of traffic policing. It wasn't necessarily to keep people safe. It was to fund the departments, get any money that they could. Now, how it affects our communities is that, we get profiled all the time. Just the other day, I was in my neighborhood and I drove by a congregation of police officers. Let's call them a congregation of police officers. A bunch of police officers on Granby Street, I want to say, in Hartford. Me and an associate were out there, and we said, this looks a little suspicious, so we're gonna go pull up on them. So we hop out the car out of a property. We parked at a property that one of my friends owned, and we walked over and we started asking questions about the scene that we're seeing. I asked someone what happened, and they said, well, the police officers arrested someone who was jaywalking. They said he was jaywalking. And the last time I spoke to the chief of police, he told me that the police wouldn't be doing a lot of the broken window policing. And if you don't know what broken window policing is, it's when police officers choose to enforce laws that they would otherwise not enforce in other types of neighborhoods, if you get where I'm going. So I say, well, hey, that sounds like broken policing. I say that to my associates. And we continue going forward. and we go talk to another individual, and they say, yeah, so they let the guy out who was jaywalking, and they arrested a guy who was cursing at the police. So that at that point, I took the initiative and I went over and I just looked at them and I said, hey, look, it was under my understanding that you guys wouldn't be conducting any broken window policing or enforcing of laws that don't need to be enforced in our neighborhood. And they were whispering to each other and they said, it's not broken window policing, blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, it is. Because, these people live in this neighborhood. And sometimes they cross the street, they might be going right across the street to the corner store or something. It doesn't need to be a big deal. You'd be better off saying, hey, try to get on the crosswalk, or just not saying anything at all. It's not going to get anybody hurt. They've been living in these streets for about 10 plus years, most of the people in the neighborhood. They tried to give me a hard time, and I said, about the guy who they arrested, who was cursing at them. I said, well, now you're crossing into constitutional territory, because fuck is protected by our First Amendment right, especially during protests. And they were trying to say the First Amendment would only go so far. One of them actually tried to say that to me, that the First Amendment can only go so far. And I just gave him a look. I said, are you sure about that? And they let the man out the car. So these are the type of instances that a lot of people don't see. Like there's not necessarily a statistic that you can add up, because some of these things don't get paperwork, right? They're just instances where police officers are kind of just being bullies in our neighborhoods. And it's just what they do, it's just the product of the origins of policing, which was slave catching.
Yeah. So I really appreciate y'all for kind of laying that groundwork. And the thread that I'm pulling out is this idea of intention, what can begin as an intention of just trying to keep everyone safe, quote unquote, right? That can kind of spill a little bit into maybe what is seen as discretionary misuse of what's on the books. And so my next question is, can you talk to me a little bit about some of the motor vehicle laws that we're seeing in Connecticut right now? And how have they been potentially misused? How have they potentially been misused as of late?
I think, that's a good question. And I think, one of the things that Michael brought up, which I think was important, right, was about sort of the use of some of these laws and how they apply in some areas versus another. Something that I think is important to remember is that the motor vehicle code was written in such a way that it is virtually impossible for anybody to get behind the wheel of a vehicle and not be having some technical violation of the motor vehicle code, oftentimes before they even turn the car on. Now, in some cases, if the car doesn't have a equipment or administrative offense, then it is not hard for there to be some technical violation of the motor vehicle code that a cop could identify typically within 30 to 60 seconds. So I think it's important to just start with that framework, because what it tells us is that this is an area where police have a great deal of discretion, which is, I think, the point that Claudine brought up with her question. And then the question being, well, have we seen any data or trends that show that this discretion may apply differently to different groups? And the answer to that is yes, we have seen that. And the easiest example of that is in the application of our equipment and administrative offense laws. So there has sort of been when we go out and we talk to police and we see that they say do a lot of defective lighting violation stops in a particular neighborhood, and we don't see that type of enforcement occurring anywhere else. Oftentimes the response we get is, listen, this isn't driven by race, it's a socioeconomic problem, right? So it costs money to keep your car in good working order. And, there's just more people in poorer communities that don't have a working headlight, we'll say, or tail light or brake light. And so, they kind of say, hey, listen, that's just the way it is. And what we have shown time and time again in our research is that when police expose communities to the same type of enforcement, they actually tend to find violations at a similar rate across racial groups. So let me give you an example of that. In Waterbury a few years ago, we found that it was a very high percentage. They were one of the highest agencies stopping cars for registration violations. And the department said, listen, it's a socioeconomic thing, right? We run plates, a car's unregistered, we ticket and we tow them, right? It's an unregistered car, and that's related to someone's ability to pay for registration. And so we sort of thought to ourselves, well, that seems to be a policing procedure that is only occurring in the predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods in Waterbury and not elsewhere. And so the question for us was, are they creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? If we go and we run plates in a particular neighborhood that maybe has got a higher share of Black or Hispanic residents in it, and we find unregistered vehicles, we use that to say, see, look, this is why we should keep doing it. And so, in fact, what we were able to show through an experiment we ran with the department was that when they did, in fact, expose a higher percentage of white neighborhoods in Waterbury to the same type of enforcement, running plates at the same rate, they, in fact, found white drivers were driving unregistered vehicles at 7% higher rate than Black or Hispanic drivers. So we have, in a lot of areas, sort of played or sort of allowed this sort of anecdotal narrative to drive some of the enforcement trends, right? So why do we run plates in the Black or brown neighborhood? Well, it's socioeconomically driven. Well, the data doesn't prove that out, right? Why do we stop cars for low-level lighting violations in another town and that we looked at in a predominantly Black neighborhood? Well, it's part of our roving DUI patrol, we were told, and it's where all the bars are, and it just so happens to be a higher neighborhood with a higher share of Black residents in it. Well, in that example, they in fact weren't finding drunk drivers as a result of their enforcement technique, right? And so, just to circle back a bit, I talked earlier about violations on your vehicle sometimes before you even put the key in the ignition. There were almost 20,000 people stopped last year for what's called an obstruction of plate violation. And when you look into those violations, most of them are the result of a driver having a frame around their license plate that indicates maybe the college they went to or the where they bought their vehicle, that advertises the dealership. And law enforcement will say, well, the frame technically blocks part of the word Connecticut. Well, I think, right, a reasonable person can look at a license plate and know that as long as the license plate is legible, and police should know what a Connecticut license plate looks like, that the cop probably didn't really care about the fact that half the word Connecticut was blocked. But the way our motor vehicle codes are written, it was a technical violation of the law, and police have the legal right to stop cars for those things. So I think some of the conversation needs to shift to, how much of this do we put back on police to stop these behaviors, and how much of it is, do we go back to the legislature and say, here's the deal. You gave law enforcement these tools, and the intent may have been pure, right? I try and assume, although maybe that is inappropriate, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, when we passed the obstruction of plate law in Connecticut, the intent was to make sure people weren't driving around with those tint covers over their plates, because a cop does need to be able to run the plate of a vehicle in case there's an insurance issue or some other issue, right? It's just a way to even track a vehicle as a result of a crime. So I can buy the argument of needing to have a legible plate, and the intent of the law was we can't have people putting those tint covers over. The intent of the law was never because part of the word Connecticut or Constitution state is blocked by a frame around your plate, right? But the law was written in such a way, and police were taught that, that's low-hanging fruit, right? It's the same thing that you always hear about the fuzzy dice in the mirror or the air freshener on the mirror. There's technically a law in the books that says that a motorist cannot obstruct their windshield view, Now, it's written in such a way, again, the intent, I think, was, you can't drive around and have a little tiny opening on your windshield because it's all covered in stuff where you can only see out. That's dangerous. But I think a reasonable person knows that something hanging from the rear view mirror doesn't generally obstruct your view of the roadway. But the law was written in such a way, and police have been trained to say, that's low hanging fruit. You can technically stop somebody for that violation. And again, there's sort of, I don't want to say good news, but there is data that tells us in Connecticut that those stops aren't resulting in infraction tickets, right? So the good news, I suppose, is that people aren't being financially penalized for having something hanging from their rearview mirror or having a license plate issue, but they're often used by police as a way to ask if they can search a vehicle, to then go in and to search that vehicle. And again, what we find is a very low return on investment. So those searches tend to yield little to nothing. So it would be one thing if the strategy, of that type of enforcement showed that police were getting lots of guns off the street or lots of drugs off the street, and they could point to and say, hey, look, we got all these weapons that were used in these crimes off the street. But the reality is that the data tells us that most of those searches result in nothing, and the searches that do result in something result usually in small amounts of marijuana that is actually at this point now not even an arrestable offense. So I could go on, so I'm going to just stop so that you and Michael can weigh in. Sorry.
I mean, yeah, Ken, you touched on literally a follow-up question that I wanted to ask was these secondary stops or technical violations as almost like a gateway to looking into maybe some kind of crime reduction tool or using it as a way to stop folks for another reason, but the secondary stops as a way to open up that door.
Let me give you one real example because I think it illustrates it. We had identified a department a few years ago as having significant disparities in traffic stops. So we went in, we had a conversation with the department, and we said, we're noticing that enforcement, it was the town of Hamden, and they did very different enforcement in the neighborhoods that bordered New Haven from everywhere else. And in particular, they were mostly stopping cars in the predominantly Black neighborhood that bordered New Haven for low-level equipment and administrative offenses. And they were searching tons of cars. As a result, they were asking, can we search your car? They were getting consent, and they were searching cars. To help us understand what's going on, why this strategy in this neighborhood and not anywhere else. And they said, well, it's part of our crime reduction strategy. That neighborhood, we have more calls for service, we have more crime. There's crime that spills over from New Haven, the crime, and so we have cops in that neighborhood stopping cars for any reason that they can think of, searching cars so that we can get guns and drugs off the street. Okay. So the next question was, how effective is this? Well, we've been doing it a long time. Of course it's effective. It's about having a presence, about letting them know we're here. Okay. So we went back and we said, well, we're going to look at the data and we're going to help to figure out how effective of a strategy it is. And in fact, what we were finding was that they were only finding contraband 7% of the time. So less than 10% of their searches resulted in police even finding anything. And most of what they found was, again, small amounts of marijuana, right? Not less than half an ounce of marijuana. Oftentimes, right, they would note in their report it was a roach and there wasn't even enough to test if there was enough marijuana. So what the police chief at the time agreed to do, which was, I think good of him, was he said, I'm going to try an experiment. I'm going to tell my officers they cannot stop cars in that section of town for low-level stops anymore, and they cannot ask to search a vehicle. If they build a good probable cause, they can search a car, but they can no longer stop a car because its taillight is out, ask them to search the vehicle. And he goes, but I have a feeling that what we're going to see is increased crime, and but we'll try it. Okay, so we came back 6 months later, and I think they were surprised to find that their crime rate had actually declined 5%. Their accident rate was down 15% because police were focusing on, again, using the motor vehicle codes to focus on those violations that cause accidents. Their racial disparity disappeared. They searched far fewer cars, but the searches they did conduct were successful over 70% of the time, from 7 the period before that. And I think that's when the light bulb really went off of people saying, of the department saying, oh, maybe we don't need to do that type of policing. And I think what they learned was that presence of police in a high crime area is more important than the strategy that they were employing. And so what I mean by that is saying they realized that by having cops in that area out of their cars, talking to people, getting to know the community, right? Sort of the community policing model was much more effective than simply saturating the area with cops that don't ever get out of their cars, and don't ever interact with the neighborhood, and just stop lots of people and come up empty-handed most of the time.
Thanks for that, Ken. Mike, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm just gonna say a little bit, just to kind of continue on one of the things, a few of the things that Ken was saying.
We can't hear you.
You guys can't hear me?
You sound a little distant.
Yeah, just like your microphone might be covered or something. Or you...
It's not covered. I might have to leave and come back if you guys can't hear me.
Oh, okay. Your technology issues.
Yeah. All right, hold on.
Okay. All right. So whenever Mike comes back, we'll fold him in to the conversation. Oh, there he is.
Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So I was just gonna pick up after one of the things Ken said about, giving police officers benefit of the doubt and stuff like that. Yeah, they're people too. You know what I mean? Like, I'd love to be able to do that. It's just it gets difficult to do that when they're doing things the way that they are doing things. There was a report done on about 100 million traffic stops. I think it was done by Stanford University. And I don't know the exact percentage right now, but I know that a large percentage of the individuals that were stopped within that 100 million were either arrested or deported. So, we do have a deep-rooted issue with policing and transportation, especially with people of color. I saw someone talking in the chat about how, how it is between Wethersfield and Hartford. And I just want to say, piggyback on that, just about any border in Hartford, Windsor's border, Bloomfield's border, the police are often, conducting predatory practices by sitting in those areas to see who's going to cross the border, doing what speed with what headlight. And that's just things that I've noticed as someone who's lived in the area for 20 years now. Now, as far as, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought.
Lots of time for you to find it again.
Yeah, it's because of all the technical difficulties and everything.
Yeah.
Michael, to your point though, about say like Wethersfield, right? Because you bring
Border
up
towns.
a good point about these border towns.
Yes.
In our research, again, over the last decade, we have found that the departments that have been most predominantly identified with significant disparities tend to be whiter suburban communities that border our cities in Connecticut, whether that be Bridgeport, New Haven, or Hartford. And in the case of, say, Hartford, for example, right, I think it's been well documented, the research regarding Wethersfield, but also, right, you're right, some of the other towns that border Hartford. And in fact, a number of years ago, at some point, we had identified every department that surrounds the city of Hartford as having significant disparities. And what you would almost always see in these communities is police presence much greater at the border of the major city. And as you saw presence increase at the border, you also saw the nature of enforcement increase. So the types of violations that police were looking for changed pretty dramatically as they got closer to Black and brown communities. And so what I mean by that is you would tend to see in the neighborhoods of, say, the residents in Wethersfield or West Hartford or Windsor, right? Stop sign enforcement, speed enforcement, things that residents would typically call to complain about, right? The safety issues that they're concerned about with kids maybe being outside and They would target high accident areas, right, with certain type of enforcement at traffic lights, et cetera. And as you moved closer to the border, what you almost always saw was those types of stops decreased dramatically. Defective lighting stops went way up. Administrative stops went up, right? Stops for an unregistered vehicle, things of that nature. License plate issues, right? That whole display of plate issue became much more prominent. Window tinting, right, becomes much more prominent. Now, some people say, well, listen, you can't, tell the race of a driver inside of a vehicle with heavy tints, but right, we know that there's something called profiling by proxy, right? So as you get closer to the border and there's an image in the mind maybe of law enforcement or a bias about certain types of vehicles that might be driven by certain groups of people, right? That becomes profiling by proxy. And so at one point I had done a heat map of all of the towns that surrounded the city of Hartford. And it was just bright red right at the borders of Hartford, with the exception of the west end of Hartford. There was really no enforcement in and around the west end, but all the other, and then obviously where Hartford intersects the river, right? But in all the other places where Hartford directly touches a major city. And what's interesting is we published a report in June specifically on Wethersfield. And I think this is really, I don't want to get into the weeds, but I do think the finding was fascinating.
And it's not just
Go ahead.
And I was just gonna say this because I got my I got what I was gonna tell everyone back. It's not just when we're on the road and driving either. Something that I see a lot of predatory practices in Hartford have to do with just the I don't want to call them meter maids, the parking authority. They also engage in a lot of predatory practices as well. I actually recall an instance when my organization was having a meeting with Mayor Barone, and my assistant and CFO, I guess she had like maybe one or two unpaid parking tickets, and we were told, it was just to me it was just a bit unnecessary, and we're literally in the midst of a meeting with the mayor of Hartford, so we got it straightened out and everything, but it was just a predatory practice. And that's another thing about policing is over policing in our neighborhoods when it comes to transportation. It's not always about like putting us in jail or deporting us. Sometimes it causes a lot of financial a lot of financial trouble. A lot of us might not be able to pay that ticket immediately, and we need a little bit more time. And I feel like because the way that the system is, it's so punitive that it doesn't really allow for any sort of emotion or understanding when it comes to a lot of the issues that Black and brown people face, especially when it comes to socioeconomic issues like being unable to pay a parking ticket immediately. That's not always easy for an individual to do. And then, you still have to park. Like we had to park to go meet with the mayor, and we did not have enough room for everyone in my vehicle. So she had to use her van, and that van got towed while we were in a meeting. It's just predatory practices like that end up happening in our communities. And I can name dozens that didn't even just happen to individuals that I know, just people that I get stories from on the street. And these things, I guess, there might be statistics out there, and I love that you come equipped with the statistics, Ken. So thank you so much for that stuff. But some of this stuff doesn't come up in any reports. No one does reporting on some of this stuff, and it just happens, and we kind of just let it go under the rug because Black and brown people, we don't really, we kind of just bow out. We know that this is the way that things are for us. So we don't tend to fight it. We might fight the ticket, but like we don't fight the predatory practices that keep happening in our neighborhoods because we kind of feel powerless in opposition to them.
Yeah, you bring up such a good critical point, Mike, about how these instances, if just looked at in silo scenarios, don't seem like a lot, but when they all compound on each other, you know, the idea of getting your car towed and how much money it costs to actually get it out of the tow yard, and how you have to have that money in cash. And, you know, all of those practices can really compound on the suffering and the inequities that happen in marginalized communities. And Ken, I really appreciate you bringing up the idea of the notion of border towns and what border patrolling actually does, because I think when people hear, you know, border patrol, we think about it within the context of immigration and moving, but the intent of border patrol is the same way. We are clocking how people are moving from space to space and are doing that with the idea or the notion that maybe those people don't belong in this particular space that they're trying to move into. And so let's now see how we can catch them on something else. So before I move on to the next question, Ken, did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
I just wanted to, we were talking about sort of border patrol and the different nature of policing in different communities. And I wanted to just highlight some of our recent findings from our Wethersfield report, not to pick on Wethersfield, but because I think, you know, it was a really fascinating finding when we produced this report in June. And we basically ran an experiment. We said, okay, theoretically, right, there are Hartford patrols one side of the border and Wethersfield patrols the other side of the border. Okay, now Wethersfield, you would think, there's a bunch of roads that connect Wethersfield and Hartford, right? That are local roads. I'm not talking highways, but local roads that start in one town, and as you drive up the road, you end up in the other town. And so we took a 1 mile radius from the border from the border between Wethersfield and Hartford, and we said, okay, it is possible that as you drive those roadways from, say, Hartford into Wethersfield, that the driving population might get, say, whiter because you're approaching a whiter community. And on the opposite end, if you're driving from Wethersfield towards the border of Hartford, you might see it increase and become a more diverse driving population, but it should be happening pretty smoothly, right? So, you know, as you get closer to the border, it might gradually get more diverse. Now, you would assume that police in Hartford might stop a more diverse driving population, right, in their side of the border because the resident population is more diverse than, say, Wethersfield, okay? And there shouldn't be any, we took the border and we thought it was okay, there shouldn't be any specific jump at the border, right? There shouldn't be a drastic change when you cross over the border from one town to the other. Any difference should be pretty gradual. We found that when you cross the border from Hartford into Wethersfield, right at the border on the Wethersfield side, you were 13 percentage points greater as a Black motorist and 15 percentage points greater as a Hispanic motorist to be stopped on the Wethersfield side of the border than Hartford, like instantly. Right. So as soon as so Wethersfield was stopping 13 and 15% respectively greater Black and Hispanic drivers right as you cross the border into Wethersfield. Right. That I think is something when we talk about Border Patrol that we've certainly been looking at. And I think it gets at some of what Michael and Claudine were talking about. And as we have always maintained, you know, it's important to remember that what is on the side of the border in Wethersfield, for example, but two major grocery stores? And what do people in Hartford not have? A major grocery store. And what do people need? Food, right? And so it comes back to sort of this basic idea of freedom of movement. And I think it's larger, what Michael and you are saying, it's larger than just traffic enforcement. Traffic, what we're looking at in our data is just looking at this one little piece of it, but it also gets to like, where do we place these things? And people need to buy food and they need to come in and spend their money in these communities and they need to, and so it's complicated, I guess.
It's complicated. And it's difficult being a retainer for all this information because that is exactly where I live. I live right on the border of Hartford and Wethersfield, and crossing into Wethersfield, you know, you get nervous. I I do all of this work around policing and all of that, but that still doesn't mean I'm not afraid of what may happen if I have a direct encounter with police officers. So thank you for these rich answers. First of all, I want to give a shout out to everyone engaging in the chat. It is beautiful. I love these reactions. I love that y'all are so engaged. Thank you, Tony, for moderating and dropping links as they pop up. As I want to say again, welcome to the new folks. We are asking that you hold your questions until the end, or at least drop them in the chat so that you don't forget them. And we will do our best to get to the Q&A at the end of my list of questions. And so thanks for being with us so far. So my next question kind of expands a little bit, right? We've been talking about a lot of like the individual discretionary practices of police officers as they are engaging with traffic enforcement and motor vehicle laws and kind of how they roll out in different communities. Now I want to expand a little bit and talk about what we've been seeing happening in the last few years around new solutions for policing that are centering automated enforcement, technology and surveillance technology to address traffic and pedestrian safety. What are some of the impacts that you're seeing? What are some of the impacts that these solutions are creating in our communities? And what are some of the unintended consequences that we're seeing from these new solutions?
Well, let's just remember, right? Technology has a potential role to play in lots of different facets of society, but technology isn't perfect and it can't be the answer to all of our problems. And also, let's remember that the technology might not be, say, biased, but the application of the technology might be. And just as an example, I'll use license plate readers. More and more police departments over the course of the last decade have equipped vehicles, police cars, with license plate readers. It's the ability for, when they're turned on, they can scan hundreds of license plates in a minute, and it will tell the police officer whether a car is unregistered, or there might be some administrative offense, or maybe the registered owner of the car has a suspended license. Well, there's a couple issues, right? So that's good, right? It prevents, say, the officer from having to type that into their vehicle when they're trying to do certain types of enforcement, but it's not perfect. Because as we saw in the Waterbury example, where were the license plate readers deployed? Predominantly in the Hispanic neighborhood. So, because there was an underlying assumption that was biased, that, there was a socioeconomic impact, and that turned out not to be true. So, there need to be clear safeguards in place to ensure that if technology is going to be introduced into the traffic safety world, that equity is elevated to be a big component of that conversation. So oftentimes I have found in the traffic safety world, there are two things that drive the conversation: reduce fatalities and reduce injuries. And that is fine. I think that's important, right? I get it. We want the roads to be safer. We want nobody dead, and we don't want anybody injured. But we also have to elevate to that same level. It needs to be three things: reduce fatalities, reduce injuries, and do it in a fair and equitable manner. And if we don't, and if technology can help with that, great. But technology for technology's sake isn't necessarily the solution. The same is true for, say, red light cameras. Red light cameras, we've seen them across the country, and I don't have a position one way or the other on whether or not, right, it's a good enforcement technique or not. But my concern is, where do we find more red lights? In our major urban environments. That's the way cities are set up. So we again have to remember that it might seem like a good solution to the problem. Hey, if we put up red light cameras, that's a way to stop certain types of accidents. And that has to be weighed. That has to be a part of the conversation. But equal to that needs to be, where are the red light cameras being placed? Who is most likely to be impacted? How effective is the technology? And is it fair and equitable, the application of that technology?
Thanks so much, Mike.
And at the end of the day, we're just gonna go back to square one again. This stuff is just to make money. It's just here to cut costs. If you don't have to have a body out on the street and you have a camera out on the street, that's going to save the department money, and it's going to make them money because they're going to conduct predatory practices in order to make money off of a disenfranchised community that doesn't even really have it. And just like what Ken is saying about how, we got these, we have a lot of, stoplights and things in our neighborhoods. It's all a part of this corrupt system. That's what it is. There's no like and ors. Like, I get it, we can give them the benefit of the doubt all we want, but in reality we know what it is, and we have to speak out in opposition to that. We know a lot of people in our neighborhoods who speed and do things that they probably shouldn't be doing, maybe not even in their own cars, but there's definitely a better way to handle it than this. In my opinion, they put a lot of bumps in the streets and things like that. I don't feel like this stuff is solutive. Like, it's not a real solution. I remember I spoke to Ken not too long ago. We were talking about possible solutions. I'm more for solutions than criminalization. I don't really like the options that we're being given to curb these issues. They just feel like they're going to cause more problems. And I'm the type, and it's just the way that I am. I'm the type of person that likes to think things through three times over. We have to start thinking about solutions, and we have to think about what the solutions to our problems are going to cause, and we have to just think forward. We can't just think about things in order to stop something because you don't want to see it, because that's rooted in conservatism, and conservatism is rooted in white supremacy. So we need to start thinking about actual solutions that can not only, and like Ken was saying, they need to be equitable, not only curb the issue, but maybe solve the problem. And this is not something that's going to solve the problem. I know we're talking about maybe narrowing the streets and making the streets more bikeable so that people don't even need cars in order to really get around the city. And I think that might be one of the many solutions that we can start going towards. We just really need to stop making it seem like these things are going to help our community, stop the speeding, or it's not going to do that. Half of these people don't even own these cars. It could be their baby mama car. They're just out here, and that's just part of the culture at this point. There's probably a way to solve that too, but we're not going to do it with traffic cameras. I can tell you that much. Not in Hartford, not in any major city full of Black and brown people. So that's just my 2 cents on this particular issue. I am not for the traffic cams. I'm not for the fact that they're putting meters on Albany Avenue when people don't need them. Just make the city more bikeable. Make it traversable without a vehicle. Make the transportation a lot easier and affordable. And this whole borders thing, it's just all another form of redlining. All this stuff is just brand new forms of the same old crap that we keep seeing throughout history. So we have to come up with some new solutions. It's either
Mike,
my bad. What's up?
No, I was going to say you're touching on a lot of really great things, and we'll have an opportunity to kind of ideate solutions a little bit later, but you're right? It's like the ACLU has historically taken a long time stance against the expansion of surveillance technology, more from the place of what the three prongs that Ken talked about, and really thinking about equity and the impact on marginalized communities, and thinking about Hartford, who, by the way, if y'all don't know, tonight City Council is meeting, and a red light camera resolution is coming before City Council again, kind of urging the legislature to send more money for a red light camera plan. But it's really about equity, the impacts on Black and brown communities, and particularly thinking about Hartford being a sanctuary city and the unintended consequences of surveilling folks that are driving and our immigrant community. And what does it really mean when we're recording all of this information? What's happening to the information? Who has access to it? How long are we storing it for? These are all, I think, really important questions that we need to nail down and answer before we roll out expansive surveillance technology.
Well, and I think the other question too is from a traffic safety perspective. the question really needs to be back to any of these communities. What are we trying to achieve? And then is the solution that's being proposed the best solution that checks all those boxes, right? That reduces fatalities, reduces injuries, and can be done in a fair and equitable manner. Because it might turn out that if the goal, what's the real goal? If the goal is, hey, listen, we had, an increase in injuries at this intersection because people were speeding through the light and that's a problem. Okay, let's bring in the engineers and say, what is the best solution? Okay, what does the data tell us about a red light camera? How likely is that to reduce the accidents and by what percentage? Should we be thinking about putting in a rotary, redesigning it, right? What are the short-term, medium-term, and long-term costs for all of these? Oftentimes, these are conversations that don't really happen. Instead, it's, well, the red light camera might be an easy solution and somebody is pushing that. And so let's see if we can get a pilot program going, or let's see if, and again, I'm not saying that might not be effective, right? But the point is, we're not having those conversations about, have we brought the engineers in? What are we trying to achieve? And again, if the goal is safety, and if that's what the conversation needs to be anchored in, then what's your mechanism for success? If, say, there were 50 high injury accidents at an intersection, your goal is to get that down to zero. I don't know about you, but I'd want to say, okay, what traffic safety mitigation techniques are going to most likely get us there? And I'm certain from other states and other localities, there's lots of data on the effectiveness of traffic cameras. And there's also lots of data on the effectiveness of other things. I mean, Michael and I were talking the other day. He was talking about the speed bumps on streets, right? Okay, and that was certainly one traffic safety mitigation effort put in place in Hartford. And I don't know, is that the most effective way to slow down drivers? Or is it that over time we should be narrowing roadways? We know that there's lots of data that tells us that a narrower roadway for vehicles does naturally slow them down. Not having so many straightaways as we put money into maybe repaving roads every so many years. Should we be investing a little bit more money to redesign them so that they're less straight? Right? These things might seem, I hope they don't seem crazy, but they might seem crazy. But the point is, you're never going to enforce your way out of a traffic safety problem. That's just right. Because unless you have a cop at every intersection all day long, you never, so enforcement is always a short-term solution. That's enforcement plays an important role, but it's not the solution. Technology maybe plays a role. But oftentimes the people missing from these conversations are the engineers. And I always say we go to the wrong E. When there's a traffic safety problem, we tend to go right to enforcement because we can touch it, feel it. We know what they'll do. And it makes people feel good for a short period of time. But we never go, or we often, I shouldn't say never, we often don't go to the engineering side and say, okay, what can we really do here long-term to try and resolve this?
Something interesting that I also heard from that is this idea of public safety, and who is this defining what public safety means for that community, right? Are we actually including community members in that conversation about like what enforcement and what public safety actually means to them? So some excellent points. And Ken, I want to pull on this thread about maybe some trends that you've seen in other cities and towns, other cities and states. What have you seen that's working, that's outside of the wrong E, quote unquote?
Well, one of the things I just keep coming back to, again, if we're talking, my focus area tends to be on the effectiveness of enforcement, right? And so I know I saw Tony in the chat talked about the effectiveness of speed bumps and how it does work and slow people down. And so I just want to acknowledge that is not my study area. But in terms of things that are working, I just have to keep going back and repeating. If I have to mention it from now until it sinks into folks, when police use the motor vehicle code to focus on traffic safety issues, we tend to see little to no disparities in the data, and we tend to see that it's generally a good technique for trying to address traffic safety problems. So number one, I think, is getting back to a place where traffic enforcement is about traffic enforcement, and it is about a focus on improving the safety of the roadways and reacting to the safety of the roadways, not being used as a crime reduction tool. And in that light, we've seen a number of jurisdictions in the wake of the murder of George Floyd move towards what I hope Connecticut might consider doing, a primary and secondary traffic law system. So the state of Virginia is, I think, the only state in the country that did this on a statewide basis, but we saw jurisdictions like Philadelphia, as an example, most recently came out and are moving in this direction. And what a primary and secondary traffic law system essentially is you would go through, we've actually done it, gone through the motor vehicle code and said, listen, these offenses, they don't really impact, they have a small, little to no impact on the safety of the roadways. And police shouldn't be stopping cars solely for those reasons. So for example, if you have your license plate light out, right? That's not going to impact the safety of the roadway. And by the way, license plates are reflectorized now. And so the headlights from, say, a cop car can light it up and they can see the numbers just fine. Same thing with if you have, say, one of your 3 brake lights is out. That's not really going to impact the safety of the roadway because 2 of the brake lights still work. And so the idea of a primary secondary system is that a whole host of these equipment and administrative statutes would become secondary, meaning police can no longer stop drivers for these low-level equipment and administrative offenses. But if they stop a car for a serious safety violation, they could address the administrative or safety offense then. So, right, you stop a car for speeding, following too closely, talking on their cell phone, running a red light, running a stop sign, and it turns out that they have a defective light or there's a problem with the registration, they can deal with it then, but the stop cannot be precipitated by one of these lower level reasons. So I think that's something very real and tangible that we could do. And if nothing else, it would be sort of the legislature stepping in saying, we need to sort of step in and remind folks how we generally want these laws applied. And what the purpose of motor vehicle enforcement is. That doesn't mean, right, doesn't mean that some cop out there someday won't be able to stop a car for going 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? The speed limit is 35 and you did 37, and everybody knows, right, that I think that's probably, something that isn't necessarily needed, but, so I can't say that things like that won't happen, but I can say that those motor vehicle laws that have historically been used in a disproportionate way, particularly as a result of the policing that came out of the war on drugs, we can curb that behavior today, and we don't have to give up an inch on roadway safety. So that, to me, is one very viable solution.
We're here already. Let's just talk about it. What other solutions are you seeing, right? Mike, you kind of started foraying into this conversation. Let's just open the door.
They need to hire more people from the hood. It's really, it could be just that simple. I'm being real. If you hire more people from the community, I think people would give them a little bit more respect. You know what I mean? They would give them more respect. They'd be like, oh, that's bro from down the way. He just trying to do his job. Right now, it kind of feel like they be bullying us. But if they know that that's bro down the road and that you're literally out here, you're doing something wrong, and he's coming to you, he's talking to you, they're not gonna. People from your neighborhood aren't gonna just immediately go to ticketing. You know what I mean? Especially because that's just not a position that they want to put themselves in. Nobody from the same community wants to put themselves at odds with other members of the community. So of course they're going to approach situations differently. I remember we had an officer. I want to say it was Officer Cruz. I'm not sure if he was from out here, but he was on the beat every day on his bike, talking to people in the community. If something crazy go down, he's not quick to write no ticket or do anything crazy. He would just go over and be like, yo, all right, let's just figure this out. We got another officer right now, Officer Barrett. He be out here. He got an organization dedicated to giving people shoes, and I think he's from out here. I want to say he's from out here. I haven't met him yet. But that's the type of police that we would get if we continue hiring people from the community. Because historically, police officers make a decent amount of money. A lot of people in our community do not make decent amounts of money. I can imagine that an individual who works for the police department that comes from the city would automatically be driven to give back because they want to help our community. There's so many people in our community that want to help our community. But because of the heinous history of Hartford PD, because of the heinous history of police officers in general and the way that things have been done throughout history, nobody wants to be a police officer. So maybe if we change and we soften things a little bit, made people feel a little bit more comfortable with the aspects of being police. It's not just about stopping the bad guy, right? Like it's just not that black and white. That's not what policing should be. That's not what it should be in my eyes. Individuals that are considered the bad guy are black and brown. So I don't think it should be like that. I think we should hire more people who are black and brown from the community. I think that would definitely curb a lot of the issues, not even just around transportation, but just policing in our communities in general.
Yeah, so Michael brings up, I think we've actually talked about a few solutions here today, right? We've talked about diversifying police departments, encouraging and trying to find ways for people that are from the community to participate in joining the profession of policing. And by the way, there's a whole host of things that need to be reformed to do that, right? We know that there are certain barriers to become become police officers that need to be dealt with. There's reforming our motor vehicle laws to bring them more into the 21st century, to ground them in what they should be grounded in. There's having engineers as a bigger part of the conversation when it comes to dealing with everyday issues in the city. It's about, if we're investing dollars in, say, increased enforcement, can we invest dollars in solving the long-term problem that we're trying to solve in an area? It's elevating equity in the conversation across the board. So there's lots of solutions, and I've always been of the mindset that you just gotta, like, again, start to pick those, even if it doesn't seem big, it can just start chipping away, right? So if you can make some reforms in hiring, if you can make some reforms in the way the motor vehicle laws are written, if you just keep chipping away, and I think you'll be sort of surprised how quickly you can achieve some results.
Yeah. And folks that are watching, please feel free to drop solutions that maybe you've seen in your communities, or groups that you're a part of that are working outside of maybe this kind of enforcement, because this really is like a group that we're all here because we care about the overall safety of our communities, of our neighbors and of our residents. And so if you've seen some cool things happening that maybe don't center enforcement, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Yes. Yes. Shout out to you, Elaine.
Can I pick up what Elaine just said? Can I just pick up? Because that's what I want to talk about. Where is our mental health focused unit? Where are they? It was already written into our police accountability bill. Why is that not being implemented yet? Why is the STAR program not in Hartford or in all the inner cities yet? I really wanted to get that out because I feel like that's an issue that no one's talking about. Like, ever since the bill was passed, it had the format to actually explore it, but there has yet to be any move on that across the state. Nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, Elaine, thank you again. Thank you again for bringing.
I actually think so. So Michael's, right. It's been departments who are required to do their own assessment on the integration of, say, social workers into policing, and not all departments did that assessment. Most of them did. I think about 70 of the 94 completed those assessments. But interestingly enough, I'm sort of keeping an eye on what's happening down in New Haven. New Haven is experimenting with a 24/7 social worker mental health crisis unit team, based on the CAHOOTS model, which comes out of, I believe it's Washington State or Oregon, which is this idea that, it doesn't necessarily need to be a police officer responding to certain calls, or a police officer goes with a mental health crisis team or social workers to certain calls. And they've had lots of success out there over a number of years. So I'm hoping places like Hartford can start to experiment with these different approaches like New Haven is doing, and places like Bridgeport can do the same. And regionally, municipal departments can come together. I don't know that you need this approach, say, in 94 municipal departments. We should be taking more of a regional approach to some policing services, or non-policing services, right? We did an assessment. I was part of the Connecticut Bar Association's policing task force, and we did an assessment of the all the deadly use of force incidents in the state of Connecticut dating back to 2001, over half of all of those incidents involved an individual in clear mental distress. They were either suicidal, emotionally disturbed, in a mental hospital sometimes when the incident occurred. And so, it is clear that we need more innovative approaches to dealing with the mental health crisis or people in mental health distress here in Connecticut, because we've seen a number of people unfortunately die as a result of these incidents.
And I think one thing I just want to lift up from this conversation is this notion of, we're having this dialogue because currently we exist in a society that right now is falling on policing as being the solution to basically all of society's failures, right? Let's invest more in the system of policing and, lock them up mentality. And we're seeing that in multiple arenas, not just about pedestrian safety, but about youth and mental health crises and people that are experiencing homelessness and people that, are not making a living wage and need to find other means to make money to support their families, right? And what I'm hearing is this call to folks in power, maybe our legislatures, but also really lifting up the voices of community to define what solutions look like for them, which oftentimes does not fall in the hands of policing. And I can't remember if it was you, because you and I are on a lot of calls together, but there was this conversation that was happening around, what rose out of the police accountability bill last summer, and this call for alternative response teams that aren't necessarily police being the first the first set of people to arrive on the scene, and how even police officers, when they get a call, they feel like, this isn't even our job. We shouldn't be the ones responding to this. Was that you, Ken? I can't remember.
Well, listen, I have had lots of conversations and interactions through my work with law enforcement individuals. And I do think that is generally a feeling amongst a lot of law enforcement professionals, which is, we do the best we can.
Yep.
And as I have come to believe, maybe this is right or wrong, we give police certain tools and we train them in how to use those tools. And if we look at where they tend to spend a lot of their training time as a result of what we as a society have felt like they needed to be trained in, it's largely in, right? They spend a lot of time in initial training or recertification training and hands-on combat and how to use their weapon and how to use a taser and how to use a baton and how to arrest somebody who's resisting. And it's a lot of these things that are trained in police largely as a result of wanting to ensure that they're safe and that nobody gets hurt and that they can control the situation. But not a lot of time is spent on, right, what they largely deal with on a daily basis, right? De-escalation, people in mental health crisis. And so sometimes as a society, we become surprised that police say use force in a particular situation. And I always sit back and go, well, of course they use force. That's like, those are the tools we gave them, right? If you went
right.
and you were trained and you spent all those hours and you were given all these tools and you were told to go solve a problem, you're going to use the tools you're comfortable using. So some of this has to be about, is part of the role in retraining police or providing them with new tools, different tools. That's one solution. But the other solution, I think, also is getting law enforcement to recognize, when maybe it's more appropriate to bring in somebody who has the tools to deal with the situation.
Yeah,
go ahead, Michael.
I'm gonna let you finish, Ken. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I remember talking to a cop and we were talking about the introduction of tasers. And, they said, the one thing about tasers was that, you would go to, say, a mental health crisis and, cops weren't really equipped to know how to deal with that, but they knew if they tasered you to immobilize you long enough to get handcuffs on you and get you shipped off to the hospital, they could go about their day. And if pre the taser, they didn't necessarily want to engage you in hand-to-hand combat, and they didn't, they weren't going to shoot you if, right, particularly you were an unarmed individual. So, so we introduced this new tool and police started to realize like, oh, okay, this tool, I can solve this problem faster. Because prior to that, they may have had to spend a decent amount of time engaging with the individual, trying to talk them down, it might have been the end of their shift. They might have been looking, going, right, it's been a long day. I've been doing this for, so there's lots of calculations that go in to decision making. And I look at, that story always stuck out to me when that officer told me about that, of saying, that to me is an example of potentially needing other solutions.
Yeah.
And I'm just seeing like a lot of these comments in the chat, and they're like just interesting things. You know, a lot of progressives and abolitionists seem to have joined us today, and I appreciate them for being here. And, you know, like, yes, I would love a society without the use of, police. I would love a society without prison. So, you know, like, I completely agree. But we have to be mindful of where we are right now with society's ills, right? Like, my neighborhood is just not prepared for that yet. You know, like, we're not prepared for a society without any sort of reinforcement, because there's still so much socioeconomic disparity in my neighborhood. And that would just create more issues.
Turmoil. Mm-hmm.
You know, exactly. I remember talking to the chief about, more non-lethal things that we could do in our neighborhoods to address the fact that we don't have that mental health unit yet. And I remember we talked about getting those net guns. They have like a Spider-Man gun or something like that that could essentially pin down someone who might be having a crisis, so that maybe we can have someone go over and talk to them and maybe make them feel better and ease them out of their issues. And I guess those guns are even cheaper than a standard issue policeman's pistol or Glock. I don't know what they have, but those things are cheaper. And if it's cheaper and it's a solution that we can do right now, then I think that is something that we should engage in. And while yes, that could be also frightening, I just believe that it's better than being tased, and I do believe that it's better than being shot and killed. So it was one of the solutions that we did talk about. Of course, because me and the police and our organizations don't have the best relationships with them, it's very difficult to sort of convince them to make that move, especially without community support. So, that was kind of something that happened in conversations passing. But I do think that it could possibly be a solution to, some of the like intermittent solution, something that we can do in the meantime until we get those mental health units established. And maybe we won't even engage in that tactic anymore. Maybe it'll eventually be phased out. But I think that it's better than being shot and killed and tased. I think it's better than those two options.
I think, Michael, to your point, we need to be willing as a society, and police departments need to be willing to try new things. And I'm just, for example, Berkeley, California, over a year ago, decided they were going to get police out of the traffic stop world. They were going to hire essentially non-armed, like parking meter type people, and they were going to do the traffic enforcement. I don't know if that'll work. There's lots of pros to that, and there's lots of cons. And people started talking about, that's crazy, and traffic enforcement could be dangerous. And what happens if you approach somebody with a gun? Sure, but we're so stuck in assuming policing has to stay the way it is that we're not even willing to say, well, let's try this. And not everybody. We don't have to totally throw out trap, but let's try it in this one area. Let's see how it works.
And where does that intersect, right, Ken? That intersects with our gun laws. That intersects with so much other stuff. And it's just like, if we're not looking at all of the areas where all these things are impacted and affected, then how are we going to really solve them? And that's why I think that the society just needs to start thinking about gun laws. It needs to start thinking about socioeconomic issues. It needs to start thinking about policing. It needs to think about how all of these things really affect each other. And that's where solutions to start coming from. The multiple areas that are being impacted, we need to start coming up with solutions to solve multiple issues, because that is the way that we'll come to really some real solutions, or at least solve as many problems. Because again, we can't solve all of the world's problems, right? But we can try to limit the amount of problems that we experience, and maybe even soften some of the ones that we deal with now. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Ken, but I'm just thinking about intersectionality.
You're right.
Just how.
Yes, so I want to be really mindful of time, because we actually only have 5 minutes left. And I told y'all that this hour and a half would go lickety split. And so I just want to honor and acknowledge this last thing that we landed on about this idea of intersectional solutions and how it's critical to not take things in silos, and also how critical it is to be new, be innovative, and not create this us versus them mentality, because all we're really looking for is an opportunity for literally everybody to be able to be safe and go home to their families, or at least go home to themselves at the end of the day, right? And so I want to pause our conversation there because we have one question in the chat from Tony. And I'm just going to read it verbatim. So, as a person walking, we're at higher risk of injury or death in a crash. Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents walking, biking, or getting to transit are at disproportionate risk, and studies show that cars are less likely to yield to BIPOC people walking in a crosswalk. Are there thoughts from panelists about non-car user safety improvements? I'm thinking raised crosswalks being more important in low car ownership neighborhoods, et cetera, or warning campaigns for drivers blasting through crosswalks.
I mean, I think one thing about Connecticut in particular is that we are obviously a very car-centric state. And because of that, the conversation tends not to be, it tends to be much more limited in the bike safety and pedestrian safety world. And I think that's a mistake, right? I think that we should be doing more things to innovate both pedestrians walking and on biking and scooting and all the other things that people do, right? Scootering in order to get out of vehicles. And I don't personally have a solution to the pedestrian safety issue, but I saw that Tony wrote in the chat, the idea of potentially raised crosswalks, particularly in areas that are being most impacted by this pedestrian safety issue, I think is important. We also, I think, we don't do nearly enough to encourage biking, and particularly, bike safety, right? And training drivers to know that they have to give, the right amount of space to bikers, and that they have to yield to pedestrians. And one of the solutions could also potentially be sort of what we call graduated fines, which is, we assume sometimes every traffic violation is sort of held equal, right? We have a graduated fine system for distracted driving, for talking on your cell phone, but we don't necessarily have a graduated fine system for other violations. And so we might want to consider that, which is, okay, it's one time, it was a mistake, nobody got hurt, right, in violation A, or the more serious the offense, the greater the fine. We might have to be encouraging more driver retraining in certain areas. I do think it's an important point to know that injuries and fatalities, particularly of pedestrians, are much greater in our urban environments. And it's something we haven't focused enough on.
Yep, because oftentimes we see what happens when something happens elsewhere and how quickly we're ready to jump to some kind of state legislative response.
And I was just going to say, it's not just a Connecticut problem. I'm actually in Chicago right now, and I'm going to tell you what they're called. They're called stroads. They're streets and roads. Like, they go off from the road into just whatever lot that they need to get to. It might go off into a parking lot, or even to your street. It will literally go from a wide road with no crosswalks, no ability for pedestrians to even traverse this. And there's a speed limit, it's like 60, and you can cross it. You live, like, I'm in a neighborhood right adjacent to a stroad, and there's no crosswalks. I was literally complaining to, the person I'm staying with. I was like, are you serious? Like, these people are driving 60. Are we going to cross this? They said, well, you're not supposed to. But, we live here, so we got to kind of do what we do. And I was like, this is ridiculous. And this is not just a problem in Chicago. Just to piggyback off what Ken's saying, it's a problem all over, especially in places like Hartford. Like, the streets are there. The streets are expanding. The highways are expanding. And we need to just make our towns and cities more walkable. We need more sidewalks. We need more like bike racks around areas that people visit often. Yes. Less streets and less stroads. Less stroads, and maybe even just cut the road so that we can still have the. Go ahead. What?
We got a minute left, so I have to cut you off. Wrap it up. Wrap it
Okay.
up. Wrap it up.
I'm sorry. But yeah, we just need to make cities more walkable and bikeable, traversable on foot. We got to.
All
I'm
right,
sorry, guys.
y'all. No, you're good. You're good. It's the beautiful stream of consciousness that happens when we're talking about things we care about, right? And I loved being able to facilitate this robust dialogue. Y'all in the chat were like the best audience for me to be able to moderate this conversation around.
I love
Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you all for being with us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Shout out to you, Ken. Shout out to you, Mike. Shout out to Tony. Shout out to Charlotte in the chat also. Thank you, everybody. Have an awesome, awesome day.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a Transport Rifle Ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work for us if interested. We hope to see you around.